Greetings. My name is Dexter Van Zyl, and I'm the Shulman Research Fellow for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. For more than a decade, CAMRA has been working to counter the anti-Zionist propaganda that's made its way into Christian communities throughout the world. And recently, we've emphasized an attempt to defend against the evangelical attack, on evangelical support for Israel. One of our secret weapons is Reverend Dr. Tricia Miller, an evangelical Christian who works as Senior Research Analyst for CAMRA. Dr. Miller has a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Claremont University in Claremont, California. She wrote her dissertation on Christian anti-Semitism in relation to the Book of Esther. In 2015, she authored Jews and Anti-Judaism in Esther and the Church. In this text, Dr. Miller applies the lesson of the story of Esther to the challenges facing modern-day Israel. This book, which interprets the Book of Esther as a proclamation of the human right to self-defense, serves as a compelling affirmation of Israel's right to defend itself from its enemies in the region. Dr. Miller is a credentialed minister with the Assemblies of God, an evangelical denomination with nearly 70 million members throughout the world. Today, she will be speaking about the efforts of Palestinian Christians to deprive Jesus of Nazareth of his Jewishness and portray him as a Palestinian. This has troubling implications that need to be understood by both Jews and Christians in the United States. Before we begin, let me briefly say something about the format. It will include first Tricia's presentation for about 25 minutes, then Q&A with written questions. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon for Q&A. Please submit questions during the talk. We want to know what concerns you and what you care about. And I'll take as many questions as I can afterwards. So let's get right into it, and I will turn the electronic gavel over to Dr. Miller.
Thank you so much, Dexter. Welcome, everyone. We appreciate each one of you joining us today for an expose of some of the myths used to demonize and delegitimize Israel and weaken Christian and specifically evangelical support for the Jewish state. I know some who are listening are members of the Christian Leadership Network of CAMRA's Partnership of Christians and Jews. Thank you so much for your friendship and collaboration as we work together to strengthen evangelical support for Israel. Before I get into the content for today, I want to introduce the context in which the Christian work happens at CAMRA. The Partnership of Christians and Jews is dedicated to providing a powerful response to anti-Christian and anti-Jewish voices in the global media. In the process, we combat anti-Zionism in the church, we oppose anti-Semitism, we tell the truth about Israel, and we promote essential cooperation between Christians and Jews. CAMRA's partnership is unique. We fight on the front lines of the battle for Israel and the Jewish people by identifying, researching, and exposing problematic developments in the Christian world in relation to Jews and the Jewish state. Today, in the context of current events, our research, writing, speaking, and activism is more essential than ever. Our Christian Leadership Network has developed organically as a result of meetings with some of you listening today, as well as other pastors and Christian leaders from around the US and other countries, including Canada, Brazil, the UK, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Poland, and Israel. The purpose of the Christian Leadership Network is to strengthen those who understand the importance of standing with Israel and the Jewish people by being a resource and an enabler of activism and outreach in our respective communities. This is achieved through informative emails, meetings, conferences, and calls to action when current events demand action. The topic for today's discussion is Jesus was a Palestinian and other anti-Israel myths. The claim that Jesus was a Palestinian is an essential and dangerous part of the foundation of much of the anti-Israel Palestinian narrative in the Christian world. This narrative has three primary legs of support, two of which are erroneous theology and rewritten history. Third leg is a combination of libelous accusations and false equivalencies. All of these are used to demonize Jews and delegitimize Israel. As we will see, the erroneous theology, known as replacement theology, and rewritten history are dependent on each other in the anti-Israel Palestinian narrative. Replacement theology is the belief that Christians and the church have replaced Jews and Israel in the purposes of God. This almost 2,000-year-old belief is still used today to justify Christian opposition to the existence of the Jewish state. According to this dogma, God has no further use for the Jewish people. There is no reason for their continued existence or the existence of the modern state of Israel. The problem with this fallacious belief is that the Bible refers multiple times to the covenant God made with Abraham and his heirs through Isaac and Jacob as a Berit Olam, an everlasting covenant. And that covenant included the promise of a specific land. However, believers in replacement theology don't recognize the fact that everlasting really means everlasting, and they maintain that the covenant and promise of land is no longer valid. Thus, the reestablishment of a Jewish state in the land God promised Abraham is illegitimate. There is a Palestinian version of replacement theology that replaces Jews in the purposes of God through the claim that Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land. According to this belief, the Jews who now live in Israel are of European descent and only appeared in the land in the 19th century. This erroneous theology is the foundation upon which most of today's Christian opposition to the state of Israel is based. And as you can see, this theological construct is dependent on a dishonest and intentional rewriting of history. In order to promote the false historical narrative that Palestinians, not Jews, are the indigenous people of the land, the biblical account of the history of the Jewish people must be denied or ignored. Numerous references to the people and land of Israel found in historical records left by the Egyptians, the Moabites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans also must be denied or ignored. Furthermore, the archaeological record, which irrefutably documents the presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel for thousands of years, also must be denied and ignored. Unfortunately, proponents of the pro-Palestinian narrative don't let facts interfere with the story they need to tell. Indeed, they use their theological, historical belief system to disguise their political agenda, to present it in theological terms for Christian audiences, for the purpose of undermining evangelical support for Israel. One timeless example of this strategy in action is demonstrated through a quote from Reverend Mitri Raheb, a Lutheran minister in Bethlehem. He's also the most widely publicized Palestinian theologian. He's the author of 16 books and numerous articles, which have been translated into 11 languages. This makes him a significant purveyor of error on the international stage. Speaking at a conference in Bethlehem in 2010, he said, and I'm going to read this quote, he said, "Israel represents Rome of the Bible, not the people of the land. And this is not only because I'm a Palestinian. I'm sure if we were to do a DNA test between David, who was a Bethlehemite, and Jesus born in Bethlehem, and Mitri, just across the street from where Jesus was born, how he knows that, I don't know. Anyway, he says, I'm sure the DNA will show that there is a trace. But if you put King David, Jesus, and Netanyahu, you will get nothing, because Netanyahu comes from an East European tribe who converted to Judaism in the Middle Ages." End of quote. This statement provides a vivid example of how Jewish identity and historic connection to the land is denied through the claim that Palestinians are the people of the land. If what Raheb says is true, it would mean that Palestinians are the rightful owners of the land, and they're now being oppressed by illegal Jewish occupiers. This is, in fact, the reasoning used to assert that the Jewish state is illegitimate, and everything it does to protect its people from attempted annihilation is illegitimate as well. One of the logical outcomes of the false assertion that Jews are not indigenous to the land is the outrageous identification of Jesus as a Palestinian. After all, according to their rewritten history, Jesus could not be Jewish since there were no Jews in the land when he was born. The invention of a Palestinian Jesus should be very troubling for any Christian who reveres the Bible as an authoritative source of truth and doctrine. Think about the consequences made by this false theology. The denial of Jewish history in the land delegitimizes the right of Jews to live there now, but it also results in the elimination of Christian history and the delegitimization of the Christian faith. This is because the very foundation of Christianity is based on a Jewish Messiah and Jewish disciples who lived in that land. The Christian faith is absolutely dependent on its Jewish roots, as the Apostle Paul made so clear in his letter to the Romans. The invention of a Palestinian Jesus denies the Jewishness of Jesus and deconstructs the foundations of Christian faith by severing that faith from its Jewish roots and context. A Palestinian Jesus is also dangerous for Jews. When Jesus is separated from his Jewishness, the way is paved for the same demonization and dehumanization of the Jewish people that resulted from the Nazis' identification of Jesus as an Aryan. We know from history where this road leads, and we must do everything in our power to prevent history from repeating itself. So the Palestinian version of replacement theology is anti-Israel, it's anti-Jewish, and anti-Christian. And when combined with Palestinian rewritten history, this erroneous theology results in the conclusion that the Jewish state has no right to exist. There are two institutions in Bethlehem that provide much of the impetus and inspiration for Christian opposition to Israel. They are Bethlehem Bible College and Christ at the Checkpoint. Bethlehem Bible College is a self-identified evangelical school that has sponsored Christ at the Checkpoint conferences every 2 years in Bethlehem since 2010. The conferences draw multiple hundreds of people, most of whom are evangelical leaders from the US. These leaders are targeted with a one-sided message that is based on Palestinian replacement theology, rewritten history, and libelous accusations of racism and apartheid. They then return to the US and propagate a narrative that is nothing more than Christian anti-Zionism, which is actually only a very thinly disguised expression of Christian anti-Semitism. Through content and imagery, the Christ at the Checkpoint conferences promote the very clear message that Israelis are oppressing Palestinians in the same way first century Jews allegedly persecuted Christ. The implication is, if Jesus lived in Bethlehem today, he would have to go through checkpoints just like the Palestinians do, because remember, according to them, Jesus was a Palestinian. In reality, Jesus would not be allowed into the Bethlehem of today, not because of the Israelis, but because of the Palestinian Authority, which has declared that all territory under their control must be Judenrein. This reality leads me to point out an obvious, glaring inconsistency in the Palestinian narrative. On one hand, the claim is made that Jesus was a Palestinian, since according to their political script, there were no Jews in the land 2,000 years ago. But on the other hand, the message from Bethlehem Bible College and Christ at the Checkpoint is that if Jesus lived there today, he would be oppressed by the Israelis in the same way he was allegedly persecuted by first century Jews. But how could Jesus have been persecuted by Jews if they weren't there when he was there? Which is it? Were there Jews in the land 2,000 years ago or not? Unfortunately, Palestinian propaganda does not let facts get in the way. What is important for the sake of the narrative is the perpetuation of the 2 millennia old Christian libel that says Jews persecute Christians. In addition to its conferences, Christ at the Checkpoint spreads its anti-Israel message through videos made available on YouTube. I want to give you one example, which is somewhat dated, but it provides a graphic example of just how vile Christian anti-Zionism can be, because the tactics of the enemies of Israel have not changed since this video was made. It was a 2-minute video made in March of 2015 to promote an upcoming Christ at the Checkpoint Young Adults Conference that summer. Through graphic footage that makes you sick to watch, the video equated the security measures Israel has been required to take with the atrocities ISIS was committing at the time. Images of ISIS captives about to be beheaded and the Jordanian pilot who was burned alive in a cage by ISIS were juxtaposed with images of Palestinians walking through a checkpoint at Israel's security barrier. There is no equivalency between atrocities ISIS committed and Israel's need to prevent suicide bombers from getting in. Images of the ISIS flag being waved by conquering jihadists were juxtaposed with images of the Israeli flag in front of a line of vehicles waiting at a checkpoint. Again, what is the similarity between violent jihadists on a rampage and an organized process that is unfortunately necessary for Israel's national security? Images of a watchtower and part of the security wall immediately preceded a picture of the H1N1 virus, also known as the swine flu, which is highly contagious. The attempt to equate necessary steps Israel has to take for security with a dreaded disease is nothing more than a reincarnation of a centuries-old anti-Semitic libel. This is just one of a number of highly offensive and dangerous videos produced by Christ at the Checkpoint and its sponsoring institution, Bethlehem Bible College. And it was made to encourage young adults to attend a summer conference in Bethlehem. If that much disgusting imagery was used in such a short promotional video, one can only imagine how much more anti-Semitic and anti-Israel vitriol was spilled during the conference. Another way the Palestinian narrative is promoted is through organizations such as Kairos Palestine and Kairos Global for Justice. On their website, Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice identify themselves as, quote, a worldwide coalition born in response to Palestinian suffering. These two organizations issued a statement, a joint statement just last week on July 1st, in which, quote, a global coalition of Christians issues a call for Palestinian justice. The July 1st statement was published in 12 languages, including English, Spanish, and Arabic, and has been endorsed by church leaders in multiple African countries, Australia, New Zealand, Asian Pacific countries, Europe, the UK, Latin America, Canada, the US, Lebanon, and of course, quote, Palestine. The statement begins with the following sentence, quote, Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice, a broad network of allies, including Palestinian Christians and international friends of Kairos Palestine, issue a cry for hope, a call for decisive action, an urgent call to end the oppression of the Palestinian people. It goes on to say, quote, the authors of this international call describe the release as coming at a time of global emergencies, when the world has been summoned to turn its attention to the most vulnerable. They point to movements around the world that are seeking to bring down the structures of racism and ethnic cleansing. In other words, these two organizations timed the release of this statement on July 1st to take full advantage of the unrest that has erupted in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. The reference to, quote, movements around the world that are seeking to bring down structures of racism and ethnic cleansing is a clear application of a theoretical construct known as intersectionality. Since the 1990s, this concept has continuously expanded to include many causes that are allegedly related. The wording of their July 1st statement makes it clear that Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice have intentionally linked their politically motivated anti-Israel crusade with current movements that are seeking to bring down racism and ethnic cleansing. And racism and ethnic cleansing just happen to be two of the false and libelous accusations regularly leveled against the Jewish state by those who support the Palestinian political cause. Attached to the document are the names of over 300 people and organizations, including church leaders, theologians, officers of ecumenical bodies, and grassroots advocacy networks from around the world. So you can see that this is a concerted, organized, international effort to delegitimize Israel in the Christian world, all in the name of fighting racism. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and Churches for Middle East Peace are two more organizations also attempting to make direct connections between current race issues in the US and the Palestinian cause by equating the problems here in the US with difficulties faced by Palestinians. In a letter sent to the US Congress the first week of June of this year, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, along with 26 other church organizations, demanded that the US government not support Israel's plan to, quote, annex any land in the West Bank. The executive director of Global Mission for the Evangelical Lutheran Church wrote, this is a quote, "One should be aware of the connection between the Israeli government's repressive tactics against Palestinians and those taking place against people of color in a number of localities around the United States," end of quote. The attempt on the part of numerous church organizations to connect the Arab-Israeli conflict with what is happening now in the US is an argument grounded in false equivalencies. There is no equivalency between the horrible history of slavery and racism in the US and the measures Israel has to take to protect its citizens against the stated intent of Arab Palestinian leaders to annihilate the Jewish state. Israel is not practicing slavery or racism in its efforts to keep its people safe. But just like the anti-Israel Christians I've mentioned, militant Palestinians are only too happy to appropriate the death of George Floyd for their political agenda. Indeed, an image of George Floyd wearing a keffiyeh with the Palestinian flag behind him was painted by a Palestinian artist on the security barrier in the West Bank within the first week after Floyd's death. On July 1st, just last week, the same day as the release of the anti-Israel statement from Global Kairos for Justice, anti-Israel Day of Rage protests took place in multiple cities in the US, including Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Boston. Common chants during all of these protests include "From the river to the sea" and "Intifada, Intifada." Both of these well-known slogans mean one thing: the clear intent to murder Jews and make all of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea Judenrein. In Boston, about 300 people associated with BDS Boston chanted slogans in front of the offices of the Anti-Defamation League and the Jewish Community Relations Council. Dexter attended and photographed the event, and I'm sure he will be happy to tell you more about it if you want to hear about it during the Q&A time in just a minute. These recent protests are just a few examples of the alarming rise in anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and blatant hatred of Jews manifesting throughout the US as pro-Palestinian activists appropriate and exploit legitimate concern over George Floyd's death for their own purpose, which is to demonize and delegitimize the Jewish state. I tell you all of this for two reasons. The first is to equip you with information you can use to counter myths about Israel and to fight anti-Semitism. The second is to expose how significant elements within Christianity are already aligned with the anti-Israel agenda, and to issue a warning of how it will worsen as Palestinians and some Christians continue to exploit the current situation. All the organizations I mentioned today, as well as others that I didn't mention, represent an extensive alliance between self-identifying evangelicals and pro-Palestinian forces who promote a dangerous and potentially violent anti-Semitic and anti-Israel agenda. This unholy union between some evangelicals and some Palestinians, both of whom base their positions on replacement theology, rewritten history, libelous accusations, and false equivalencies represents a serious threat that we at Camera will continue to counter and expose with your help. Before we take time for questions, I just want to encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to join the efforts of Camera's partnership with Christians and Jews. We can help inform and equip you to counter and expose the errors in anti-Israel narratives. Become a member of the Christian Leadership Network so you can be strengthened and encouraged to stand in opposition to the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel movement within Christianity. If you'd like to be added to our mailing list, please email me at tricia@camera.org. That's TRICIA@camera.org. And now I think we have time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. That was wonderful. Now, one of the questions that we've got in the queue is, why are evangelical Christians more likely to support Israel than the mainline Protestant churches here in the United States? Can you talk a little bit about essentially the motivations behind evangelical support for Israel?
Yes, and it boils down to biblical interpretation. I'm speaking in generalities, but by far, evangelicals read their Bibles more faithfully and also more literally. They believe what it says, they read it literally. And so when they see that the Bible is really centered around the history of Israel and the history of the Jewish people and a future for Israel and the Jewish people, they believe that. So they see the reestablishment of the state of Israel as part of the whole fulfillment of what's spoken of in the Hebrew prophets to bring the, where God said that the Jewish people would be regathered again. They see all of that as a fulfillment of prophecy, and they just believe that there's a future for the Jewish people because of that. The way you get to replacement theology is through an allegorical reading of the Bible, not a literal reading of the Bible. And so people who believe in replacement theology, when they see the word Israel, they think the church. When they see the word Jews or the Jewish people, they think the Christians, because they've been taught for almost 2,000 years of Christian history that there's no more purpose for the Jews or the Jewish people.
Okay. Now, one of the questions that people have is what's it like for the evangelical world outside the United States? Are they vulnerable to this notion that Jesus was a Palestinian, or do they recognize that he was a Jew? It seems pretty obvious, but what do you think?
I think that it is a far worse problem in the United States and Western countries, particularly Europe. I've done a fair amount of work in Europe now, and it is far worse. The Europeans and Americans and Canadians are more susceptible to this whole narrative because, for one thing, they're better off. They're better off, so they're more interested in a message that appeals to justice, the social justice message. It used to be equality, justice for all, which is, they get guilt, they have guilt played on, they have all kinds of factors that enter into this, but they're more susceptible. Believers in other countries, in Latin America, believers are very, very pro-Israel. In China, they're very, very pro-Israel, the Christians in China. Iran, I've met with Iranian Christians when I was in London last year. There's a very, very strong Christian population in Iran, and they are very pro-Israel. The bottom line is because they read their Bibles, they take it literally, they believe it, and they're not being barraged by this narrative, which Western Christians, European and American Christians are being bombarded with, partly because also the Palestinian motivation is they need money to support their cause, right? So they target Western countries for that purpose too.
Now, you've done a lot of work with Robert Stearns and other evangelical organizations that work to counter this anti-Zionist narrative. And can you, because I don't want to leave the listeners with a sense that essentially the evangelicals are under siege and there's nobody fighting back within this community. Can you talk to me about some of the relationships that you have with these folks and the efforts that they've invested, the time, energy that they've invested in countering this narrative?
Thank you so much for that question. That's very important to mention because I didn't have time to get into it. There is very strong evangelical support for Israel and the Jewish people in America and in Europe. And there are three organizations primarily that I've been involved, two organizations I'm the most involved with. Eagle's Wings, as you mentioned, Robert Stearns and Eagle's Wings. He's been doing this for almost 30 years, supporting Israel and the Jewish people, working for them actively. And also the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem has been in existence for 40 years. This year they're celebrating their 40th anniversary. And they started in Jerusalem in the year that all the embassies decided to pull out and move to Tel Aviv. And the Christians who were in Jerusalem at that time said, no, this isn't right. Jerusalem's the capital of Israel, and they founded the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. And they do a phenomenal work worldwide, educating Christians, building Christian support for Israel, as Eagle's Wings does.
Now, one of the questions I hear a lot, and when I deal with people, particularly within the Jewish community, is that they're a little suspicious of evangelical support for Israel. And they say, well, look, they just want us to stick around so that they convert us, or they just want to basically evangelize us and get us to convert to Christianity. But then when you talk to people individually within the evangelical community, what you find is essentially a lot of respect for the Jews as a people and Judaism as a religion. And one of the things that I see is that within the evangelical community, speaking as a Roman Catholic, but I've spent a lot of time with evangelicals, is that they support Israel because they admire the Jewish people. But can you talk to the whole notion about the conversion type, and their ultimate motivations, or, what do you think?
That's another very good question, and I appreciate it because I am asked that often by Jewish people. And in fact, I've been asked to speak in a number of synagogues and to Jewish audiences in a lot of different places on this topic. Why do evangelicals stand with Israel? And it's a part of our whole mission of the partnership of Christians and Jews to build this Jewish-Christian cooperation in these times especially. And so there's the two most frequent concerns in the Jewish community that I hear is, do evangelicals support Israel just because they want to see a fulfillment of some kind of end time scenario? And is there an ulterior motive? Do they just want to convert us? And so I address that. And of course, there are some evangelicals who believe that you need to talk to Jews about Jesus. But that is not the motivation of why they stand with Israel and the Jewish people. As you said, there is a tremendous deep respect in the evangelical community for the Jewish people, for the history of the Jewish people, for the Jewish faith, because they understand what I just alluded to when I spoke about what Paul was saying in Romans 9-11, and that Israel is the root of our faith. And Christianity is nothing. We have no roots. We have nothing if you cut that off. So there's a tremendous support, recognition of the importance of the roots of our Jewish faith. And then the belief also, like I said, based on the way that evangelicals read the Bible, that the Jewish state has a right to be there. This is a fulfillment of prophecy, that the Jewish people are being regathered and that they have a right to their homeland in their ancient homeland, and that it is the same land that they were in, that's in the biblical accounts. So.
Okay, now a long time ago, or not a long time ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, CAMRA organized 2 conferences about the status of Christians in the Middle East. And we brought in a fair number of experts about the status of Christians in the Middle East and the suffering that they endured in Muslim majority countries. And I had just converted to Catholicism. And one of the interesting things about this was that most of the people who are suffering on this oppression are either Orthodox Christians or Catholic Christians, okay? but most of the people who are involved in efforts to defend Christians in the Middle East, particularly here in the United States, are evangelicals.
Mhm.
And at one point, somebody said, "Where are the Catholics?" Somebody raised their hand, and me and one other person said, "Well, we're here." But why are the evangelicals so much more able to speak in principled terms about the suffering of Christians in the Middle East, even though these people are part of a different strain of the faith? What is it about evangelicals that makes them able to do that?
Well, again, I'd say it just goes back to their commitment, their dedication to reading the scriptures, their belief in the scriptures, and their understanding of persecution, their understanding of the value of human life, and the willingness to take risks, to be in danger. All of us who are involved in any of this kind of work understand it's not popular, that there's potential risks, but the willingness to do it based on faith and based on values and based on a commitment.
Now, and Richard, and also another thing that I'm just going to throw in there is that they worked on behalf of the Christians behind the Iron Curtain. So it's almost as if it was like after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and all along they had been thinking and talking about the mistreatment of Christians in the Middle East. It was like, okay, now we've got work to do in the Middle East. And so I guess another question is that what type of infrastructure do we need to really counter this narrative that you've been able to document? What do we do to protect the evangelical community from this narrative, which not only hurts Israel and Jews, but actually undermines the churches themselves? What can we do? What can CAMERA do? And what type of infrastructure is necessary?
Well, I was smiling when you talked about infrastructure, because I was thinking of the lack of that in the evangelical world. It's not a structured world like Catholic or Orthodox. There's more denominations than you can count. So from that standpoint, there is not an overall infrastructure that we can work with. What we've been doing through CAMERA's partnership of Christians and Jews and building this Christian leadership network has been one at a time relationship building, reaching out, pastors introducing me to other pastors, Christian leaders introducing me to other Christian leaders. And I'm glad that you asked this, because I wanted to, and I may be taking it in a little bit different direction than you intended, but I wanted to talk about what we can do, and to ask for everyone listening for their support in this. We need to be able to, once we're able to travel again, we need to be able to have meetings. There is no substitute for getting people together in person, for the networking and the connecting that goes on to build this, what you're calling an infrastructure, but it's relationship based. It's not organizationally based. So there's a tremendous need to develop relationships. We need to get out on the road again. We need to be speaking. We need to have meetings. So I was going to ask for everyone listening to this today to please be thinking about having one or both of us come to speak, to have meetings. Eventually, hopefully we can have a conference. That, of course, we need funds for. So I'm unabashedly saying, please donate to this project too, to enable us to get out, to get the message out. And another thing that we wanted to do is publish another monograph. We had a major conference in Los Angeles in 2016 called the Assault on Evangelical Support for Israel. It was an all-day conference. We had 12 speakers, and we published a monograph after that with the content of those presentations. And it's an extremely useful tool. It's been translated into Spanish, Portuguese, and Polish, because I've gone to Poland the last 3 years. That's another part of the story, but there are Christians around the world, especially Eastern Europe and Brazil and the Latino world, that I am discovering are extremely hungry for this information. So that's been translated, but since 2016, there's obviously a lot more information, data, all kinds of stuff that we could put in. We desperately need to put together a second monograph, which ideally would be based on a conference like we did before, to get new information out. And I'm telling you, when I speak in a Hispanic congregation, the Brazilian community here and locally hosted a conference for us a year and a half ago. And then I've been in Poland 3 times to speak, and I can't print enough copies of this to satisfy their desire for this material. They're hungry for this. So there's a tremendous opportunity in those worlds to get more information out. But in the United States and in Europe and the UK, there's also a tremendous need to have this documented. So I'm making an appeal for people to help us financially to host a conference again, to address new issues, and also to publish a monograph.
Okay, excellent. Now, one of the questions is, and I'm just going to read the first sentence. As an observant Jewish person, it confuses me why evangelical Christians are so concerned about the delegitimization of Israel as a Jewish country. And I kind of want to weigh in on this after you do, but what's at stake for Christians that Israel survive and thrive? And what's your gut tell you? When you address that, what do you feel emotionally? I'm not interested necessarily in like the logical arguments, but what's really at stake for you?
You want the gut feeling, the emotional feeling? Israel is everything to the Christian faith. Like I said, that's where our roots are too. That's where Jesus was. That's where all the disciples lived and walked. And every author of the Bible is Jewish. Every author of every book that we have in our Bible is Jewish. And so there's, evangelicals know this. There's a deep emotional connection to Israel.
Yeah. Now, I want to take a stab at that is, whether Christians want to admit it or not, essentially they have a stake in the welfare of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. In part because of the role that we played in the demonization and the destruction of Jews in Europe. And the thing is that if I think any Christian denomination or community that somehow facilitates the ongoing demonization of the Jewish people is betraying the faith. Emil Fackenheim said he outlined like 613 rules for the Jewish people. And he said, you shouldn't give Hitler any more posthumous victories. He said, that's really one of the rules for the Jewish people. And I think that there should be an 11th commandment for Christians in that you don't assist in the process of giving Hitler any more posthumous victories. And also just another thing is that Christianity does, like you said, Christianity doesn't make any sense without its Jewish roots. Jesus was a Jew, and everything that he was talking about was in a Jewish context. And the problem is that when we deprive Christianity of its Jewish context, it becomes meaningless. And so there was a number of questions. All right. There's been an exodus of Christians from the West Bank, and from what I understand, there's discrimination against Christian Palestinians. So why would some Christians in the West Bank demonize Jews in Israel? Why don't they talk about their persecution by Muslims? If you want to answer that, you can, or if you want me to, because I don't want to Bigfoot your presentation.
Well, I'll just say that I was going to say you should answer that and talk about the Demi mentality. Right. But it is true. There's been a major exodus of Christians. The population now in the West Bank is down to about 1%. And what the Palestinian Christian narrative is that it's because of the wall and because of the quote occupation. And it's not. It's because of their Muslim persecutors that they have to live with. And before you talk about that, I just want to point out that Christians in Israel have equal status. They are equal citizens. They have equal rights. They go to the same schools, the same hospitals. There's churches. Israel protects Christian sites. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why the Palestinian Christians are interested in promoting an anti-Zionist narrative is because they have to. They're largely relying on the Palestinian Authority for whatever safety they enjoy, and the PA is pretty shrewd about that. And if you look at a lot of the institutions that exist in the West Bank that essentially promote anti-Zionism, they all basically got their permits to build from either Yasser Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas. And essentially, and they have these little empires. Mitri Rahab has an empire. He's got his own college, his own nonprofit in Bethlehem. And essentially, he's able to operate with the acquiescence of the Palestinian Authority. And so he knows what side his bread is buttered on, which is, okay, I'm going to beat up on Israel and tell people that the proper expression of the Christian faith is some sort of supersessionist hostility towards Jews in Israel. And I'm also going to go on and tell people that Islam is essentially the gospel for Arabs. That's the way he's written about it. And one of the things is that there's a transaction that's going on when people, and I've been to a number of these Christ at the Checkpoint conferences, and on one hand, I want to thank Camera for sending me to these conferences, but on another hand, they pretty much shot my nervous system because I'm surrounded by like 300, 400, 600 people who hate Israel, okay? And they're actually most of the time pretty nice to me, but other times they're not. But the thing is that the people who go to these conferences, they want to be redeemed from the sin of being a Western Christian. And they want, and so and that's the one thing that they desperately want. And they want absolution for the privilege that they enjoy from living in the United States or in Europe. And so what they do is they get to Bethlehem and they have these relationships and these friendships with these Palestinian Christians who are authentic. They're the authentic other, so to speak. But the price for that friendship is to embrace the anti-Zionism. And rather than tell them, well, go forth and sin no more, what they do is they say, now go forth and tell them about how evil Israel is. And I guess that's what I see at these Christ at the Checkpoint conferences. So
yeah, let me pick up on that again, because I had mentioned before in one of the other answers about the guilt and the Western guilt and the way that that's used and manipulated to get people to support this cause. And that's a very big feature. But I also want to add in here, because I've talked about Palestinian Christians and Palestinian theologians, I also want to make a very important clarifying statement. This is not all Palestinian Christians. We know Palestinian Christians who live in the West Bank who are pro-Israel. Why? Because they read the Bible and they believe it. The pro-Palestinian, the anti-Israel Palestinian Christians say, we don't even read the, quote, Old Testament, what they call the Old Testament. We don't even read that anymore because it talks too much about Israel and it's not fair. So they are writing out the vast majority of the Christian Bible because it talks about Israel too much, and that's not fair. But there are Palestinian Christians who do read their whole Bible, they do believe it, and they suffer tremendous persecution. There's members of their families have been killed. There's one pastor who tells the story of how they have to keep moving their church meetings because Muslim owners of buildings get threatened by the PA if they rent the space to a Christian congregation who is not towing the line, who's not speaking the narrative, and makes it very clear that they believe Israel has a right to exist. They have to keep moving because their lease gets denied. They have firebombs thrown through their windows when they're meeting. They're beaten. Their lives are threatened. This is what Palestinian Christians face who don't toe the official line.
Right. Now there's a question, it seems like, and I probably should have asked this before, but obviously you've visited Israel a number of times and have experiences that debunk the oppression of the Palestinians. Has there been any anecdotes that you want to share with folks that like when you've been to the West Bank or been in Israel? Or when you go to the Holy Land, have you ever experienced any animosity because you're an evangelical Christian?
No, not at all. Israelis love evangelicals. Even the government recognizes the importance, the deep importance of evangelical support for Israel. There's no animosity, and quite to the contrary, there's love and acceptance. And Christians, like I said, Christians who live in Israel have equal rights. Anybody, any Christian anywhere in the Middle East would want to get to Israel. It's the only place in the Middle East where Christians are safe. You mentioned the persecution of Christians a while ago. They have no rights anywhere else in the Middle East except Israel.
Now, one of the things that some of the questions are, somebody wanted to have you give the names of the organizations that so that they can look into them further. It was Eagle's Wings, International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, and there was another group.
I didn't go into detail. CUFI, Christians United for Israel, is a powerful organization in the United States, established primarily to keep our government on track. They mobilize Christians to go to DC every year, lobby congressmen, lobby senators, write letters during the year to make sure that our government stays consistent in supporting Israel.
Okay, all right. Now there's one question that just popped. I just saw it, or maybe forgive me for just seeing it, but it says there's a conversation right now that if evangelicals were to understand themselves more as Jerusalem Christians than Greco-Roman Christians and the acculturation. What do you think about that? And I'm somebody that comes from Rome, but I've never been to Rome, but I spent more time in Jerusalem than a lot of other places.
Absolutely. I'm almost wondering if I know the person who asked that question because a number of us are having this conversation. Absolutely. The Christian faith needs to be Jerusalem based. That's where it came from. It did not come from Rome or the Eastern world, the Greco-Roman world. It did not come from there. Our faith came from Jerusalem. It's founded in the Jewish faith. It's founded in Jesus and the disciples being in Israel, being in Jerusalem. We lose, as I studied church history, we lose that emphasis already beginning in the first couple centuries of the church, where a lot of the early church fathers who had the Greek approach to interpretation, biblical interpretation. And this is where, and a lot of that included allegorical interpretation. This is where replacement theology comes from, is from the first couple centuries of the church fathers, because they read into the text allegorically. Whereas if you have a Jerusalem-based faith, you're looking at the Hebrew text, you're looking at the original, and you're looking at the original context. So absolutely, our faith needs to be Jerusalem-based.
Okay. Now, I've got time for one more question, and I hope it doesn't promote gales of laughter, but have you ever thought about trying to get this information on the public broadcasting system, like on GBH, WGBH, or any of the other, what do you think of the chances that people would actually give, evangelical Christians who support Israel a fair shake?
I actually don't know. I've never thought of that. But I'm the kind of person that says, well, we don't know until we try. So we haven't tried, so let's try it.
All right. Well, your Christian hope is better than mine. And I want to apologize for everybody for maybe, you know what the thing is, if Tricia at one point a long time ago said, you know what, we need a Christian army. And so Tricia Miller is that army. And so our time is up. My apologies to those questions that I didn't get to, and I want to thank so much to Dr. Miller. We fight back and forth. Should we call her Dr. Miller? Should we call her Tricia? And I also want to thank her for her thought-provoking talk and the really good questions. You've given us a lot to think about, and I want to thank all of you for joining us and asking the good questions you did. If you like today's conversation, we're going to have more interesting guests scheduled for the weeks ahead. For example, next Thursday on July 16th, Ricky Hollander, Camera Senior Analyst, will discuss anti-Semitism in the context of the coronavirus pandemic in her analysis, blood libels, conspiracies, and coronaviruses, always blaming the Jews. And if you want to see some of what she's going to talk about, go to Camera's website, camera.org. And it's the top article on the website. It's right there, and it's a really good article. Ricky's one of our best researchers, and every one of us is our best researcher. And if you want to know more about the future talks, send an email to tracy@camera.org, which is TRACEY@camera.org, tracy@camera.org. And we have other talks scheduled as well, and we'll be sending you notices for all these events. And I hope you'll join us. Eventually, I'll get one of these probably in September or October. In the meantime, let me wish you all a good health, and someday we're actually going to be able to see each other face to face and not over this Zoom stuff. But thank you again for tuning in, everyone.